Margaret said, this week's text is a prelude to a very familiar story that we have in the Bible. I just wanted you to get an idea of how we went into this Jesus feeding the 5,000. What did he feed the 5,000 with?
Fish. 5 loaves of bread and 2 small fishes.
2 small fishes. Sardines. Or what are those things you put on the pizza that are anchovies? Yeah. Last week I mentioned how Matthew's gospel was the most Jewish flavored of the gospels. But Mark, this week we're in the gospel of Mark. Mark is considerably smaller than any of the other gospels. And it emphasizes Jesus as an agent of change between the kingdom that is, or the kingdoms of the earth, and the kingdom of God that is to come. And just about everything you read concerning Jesus in Mark's gospel has him saying, this is what the kingdom of God is like and will be like, and this is what you can do to make that kingdom happen now. So the story of the loaves and fishes is just packed with all sorts of important symbols. First of all, it takes place in the wilderness. And you've got to understand that the wilderness in Jewish tradition is a scary and threatening place. And I agree, because I have been to that wilderness in Egypt. I have been to the desert in the Sinai region of Egypt. Here's an example of what life in the Sinai is like. We were told by our guide that if we took off our boots for whatever reason, when we went to put them back on, we had to shake them like this. Why do you suppose that would be?
Scorpions.
Scorpions, exactly. Scorpions. And the little scorpions are more dangerous than the big scorpions. They're the ones that will take you down.
I just might mention that there are scorpions in this area. We live in Oroville. I was bitten by a tiny scorpion.
How'd that feel?
Well, fortunately, I didn't react too badly to it, but anyway.
It'll mess you up, though. It's more than a bee sting, that's for sure. But, did you know that if you shine a black light on a scorpion at night, it will glow? I did not know that until our guide took us outside one night and shined a black light just to show us how many scorpions there are out there that we don't see.
What do they live on?
I didn't ask that.
Tourists.
I have no idea. Oh my God. But you know, that adds to the scariness of the wilderness, doesn't it? Because not only do you have to be aware of the things that you can see, but at night you've got to be aware of the things that you can't see, unless you have a black light. But the wilderness is also seen in the Jewish tradition as a place where God provides. And when the children of Israel were wandering around in the desert, God made sure that there were quail and manna every day for the people to eat. And as we saw last week, it was quite a stretch for people to actually muster up the trust in God necessary to know that God will provide for them day to day. But eventually they accepted that idea. Eventually they got used to it. And eventually the wilderness became a place of refuge where people would go to reconnect with God during spiritually dry times. The prophets believed that God would remake the wilderness. So prophets like Ezekiel and Isaiah would say things like how God would remake the desert into a place where there is pools of water and cedars and olive trees sprouting up. And then closer to the time of Jesus, there were some folks in the Jewish tradition who believed that this world would eventually come to an end and that the world to come would sprout up in the desert. It would be formed in the desert. And that's why you found communities like the one over at Wadi Qumran who spent their time making copies of scriptures as they read out in the desert. That's where we get the Dead Sea Scrolls, by the way. These folks chose to live out on the edge of the desert so that they could prepare the way of the Lord. So Jesus and his disciples would often retreat to the wilderness to charge their spiritual batteries so that they could be fresh and rested when they faced large crowds of people seeking healing and teaching. And so in the story of the loaves and fishes, Jesus and his disciples went out to the wilderness. And what happened next was an introvert's nightmare. People followed them out into the wilderness. And not just a few either. Huge crowds of people who were eager to hear Jesus' teaching went out into the wilderness with them. But instead of chasing the folks away, Jesus began teaching. Then it started to get late. And the crowd that was just eating up every word of Jesus started getting hungry for something else too. They were hungry for food. So Jesus' disciples, I suppose, were probably a little miffed at him for taking the time to teach them instead of showing them along their way. So when they started getting hungry, when this big crowd started getting hungry, the disciples said to Jesus, "See, you should have sent them away. Now you got a problem, don't you, Jesus? You've got a bunch of hungry people and no food that we can see. This is what happens, Jesus, when you don't establish firm boundaries." So what are you going to do now? Now you're going to have to send them back in town. And Jesus says, "No, I'm not going to send these hungry people back in town. In fact, here's what's going to happen. You're going to feed them." And you know, this wasn't long after Jesus told his disciples that they actually had the power and the capacity to work miracles. But as usual, the disciples didn't get it. They didn't listen. And they thought Jesus wanted them to go into town to get takeout, to buy bread there and bring it back to the people. And they're just like, "Are you kidding, Jesus? You expect us to go into town and come back in time to feed these people? We are way out in the middle of nowhere." And Jesus said, "No, I want you to go on out and see what kind of food resources we have right here among the people." So the disciples came back with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And even though Mark doesn't point this out, I could just imagine the disciples getting a little snarky with Jesus, saying, "You know, you wanted to see how much food we had here? Well, here you go, boss. Here's the food we gathered up. We have 5 stale, crusty loaves of bread and 2 overly salted small fish with their heads still attached. You think that'll be enough to feed this crowd of, 5,000 people?" But remember, in the Jewish tradition, bread represented the presence of God. Okay? Jesus takes these loaves and he blesses them and he breaks them and he has the disciples distribute them among the people. And he does the same with the fish. And you know what? Not only was there enough for the people who were gathered there, there was enough left over to fill how many baskets? 12. And remember, 12 is a significant number in the Jewish tradition. What does 12 represent?
Tribes of Israel.
12 tribes of Israel. Or in other words, the whole people of God. So not only is there plenty for the folks who gather at the table, there is enough left over to provide for everybody. The message is simple and clear. There's enough. No need to be stingy. No need to hoard or grasp or compete for scraps. There is enough. Everything you need is right here. God provides. how often do we limit ourselves as a church when we say, we can't do this, we can't do it, we cannot afford to do something new and exciting in our church. Nope, just can't do it. We have limited resources. In fact, what we need to start doing now is cutting back. We're in survival mode now. Shoot, there's not enough to do what we need to do. There sure isn't enough to do what we would like to do. In fact, here's the new rule. You know how little kids come along when they're toilet training and they say number 1 and number 2? That is a good reminder for us now for our new rule here at the church. 1 or 2, because we're having to cut back. We can't do it. We cannot do what we like to do. It is just plain unrealistic to think that we can do anything other than hang on to what we have and just hope for the best. We cannot even afford to keep doing the same things that we used to do. And don't tell me to have faith and that God will provide, Jesse, because if that were the case, we wouldn't be in this position in the first place. Nope, can't do it. We cannot feed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Oops. As Jesus says, oh really? See, Jesus challenges us to see that what we have is enough. Well, enough to do what? Well, enough to do the things that we thought we couldn't do. Here's another way of looking at it. When a church does what Jesus asks us to do in the way that we serve the kingdom of God, or in the way that we live out our faith in the presence of the kingdom of God, we often discover we've got more resources than we thought we had to begin with. In fact, we often find more than what we need. And one of the remarkable morals here in this story of the 5,000 is that when we do what Jesus says, our actions themselves become a means of grace whereby we experience the kingdom of God. In other words, as we feed, God feeds us. We've got enough. Trust me when I say that. Well, where are those little magic loaves and fishes then, Pastor Jesse? We're living in a postmodern, post-denominational, post-Christian era. Churches like us are folding every day, literally every day. What are we going to do? Good question. Sometimes the challenge of raising a budget seems as large as the challenge of, feeding 5,000 with just 5 loaves and 2 fish. Here's something for you to consider, though. Are there people in the community who we've just overlooked? Are there financial resources available right in front of us that we haven't figured out how to use yet? I don't know. It's so easy for us to get overwhelmed and unable to imagine the possibilities that are right in front of us. All I know is that God provides. That's a promise. There is enough. It's like my little acorn here. This is a perfect acorn. Well, it's got a little flaw in it right here. But this acorn is enough. It is what God created it to be. It is what God created it to look like. Nothing wrong with this acorn. Same with all of you. Nothing wrong with you. You are what God created you to be. And you are here as you are today, just as this acorn is here today as it is. But you know what? This acorn's got a lot of potential, doesn't it? Because this acorn, whoo! I couldn't do that again if I tried. This acorn has the potential of being in the earth, and with a little bit of water and a little bit of sunshine, this acorn can become a huge tree. We know what big trees do,
I do.
just like the one behind me. And you know what huge trees do? They make more acorns. Such potential in this. We have everything we need right here. And we have everyone and everything in this room we need right here, right now. Would you pray with me?